So, of course, good morning, everybody. You see me here as Marjorie because in my haste, I didn't log in as myself. I just logged in as the last person who was here. But I am Olivine Thomas of the Human Resource Development Programs Unit in the Department of Sociology, Psychology, and Social Work at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. And I am delighted to welcome everybody to a conversation that my colleagues and I will be having with Professor Guy Standing. Now, a lot of you will know that Professor Standing is the co-founder of the Basic Income Earth Network, and he is a British professor of development studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Professor Standing has written significantly in the areas of labor market policy, labor market flexibility, unemployment, social policy, and structural adjustment. He has done research in Jamaica, and his work on labor force participation in the ILO is very highly regarded. In fact, of the persons that we invited here today, 3 of them mentioned this ILO work. So, you know, they were thrilled to even have the chance to speak with you. But we in the HRD unit invited Professor Standing in March of this year to be the keynote speaker at our 25th anniversary conference. But of course, everybody knows why that conference and many others had to be canceled, not even postponed. And but we still wanted to hear what Professor Standing had to say. So we've invited him to address us in this, which is our annual orientation lecture. But this year we decided that the lecture wouldn't just be a straight lecture. What we were going to do is have a fireside chat. And that, of course, has grown. And we've invited several other persons, lecturers at the University of the West Indies and students. And so we'll have a more veranda type discussion, the kind of thing that you sit down and just share ideas with friends. So we wanted to start off. I, of course, Professor Standing and I have spoken at length about this, and he knows that I am interested to know how he applies his ideas for work for persons in human resource development and organization studies. So we'll get to that. But I actually wanted to start somewhere new, somewhere unusual for us. I don't know how many of you have been watching a video that Professor Standing has done with Massive Attack and Young Fathers. And it's getting heavy rotation. But in the video, you'll notice that he comes out swinging very hard against globalization. He actually names, surprisingly for me, I suppose, that the current pandemic, and for persons watching this video in another 4 or 5 years' time, I'm talking about the COVID-19 pandemic that has ruined everything for 2020. But he names that as the 9th giant that blocks the road to a good society. And he ranks that along with things like climate change, inequality, debt, stress, the loss of personal, civil, and human rights, automation, and neo-fascist populism. So, I mean, that's a very, very serious charge. So I actually wanted to start off by asking Professor Standing how he links globalization to the current pandemic and why.
Well, I hope everybody can hear me, and I'm very pleased to be talking to you. I wish I were there. It's many years since I've been to Jamaica, and did research, as Olivine has mentioned, and even wrote several books, including, as I was telling Marsha, a book about Jamaican women, which was unexpected in my career. And it's a country I've always loved, so I would love to be back at Mona. And it's disappointing for me, particularly, to be talking to you from a little room outside Geneva in Switzerland. But I think this is a very good time to be starting graduate studies. I really wish that I were doing so right now, because you're at a moment of the global transformation, which is a crisis of enormous proportions, but is at the same time intellectually a fantastic moment where we're going to have to develop new vocabularies, new paradigms, new approaches, new images for understanding and developing a new coherence in both in scholarship and in practical public policy. And the thing that Olivine has just mentioned goes back to the work I've been doing over the past 40 years, the whole of my career, because I realized that in the early 1980s, what was started by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and taken up by the IMF and the World Bank and the Chicago School, which we now call neoliberalism, was an attempt to fundamentally change the nature of our economic system. It was a period in which they preferred to liberalize finance, open up markets to international capital, to dismantle the institutions and mechanisms of social solidarity that stood against the market. And they ushered in a period which has evolved, and I've written a book about the way the economic system has evolved, where we saw a gradual development of a domination by finance, by Wall Street, City of London, and elsewhere. And this has created a globalized economic system, which I've called Rentier Capitalism. Most of you are not economists in this conversation, but essentially what this has meant is that more and more of the income and wealth being generated all over the world has been going to the owners of property, physical, financial, and intellectual property. And less has been going to people who perform labor. And that's the theme of the video that Olivine's just mentioned. And the essence of what has happened is that as this structural shift has taken place, the old income distribution system of the 20th century has broken down. And we have a new global class structure. The class structure that's emerged has a plutocracy at the top, disgustingly, obscenely wealthy billionaires, multi-billionaires, who've been doing fantastically well, incidentally, out of this pandemic. Their wealth and income has been shooting up, while most of the world income has been shooting down. And then underneath them is an elite serving their interests, both of which are gaining from property income. And then you have a salariat. Very few of you will be entering the salariat. But when I was a student, it was presumed that if you went to university, if you had a second degree in particular, you would be taking a stable career opportunity, stable employment, rising incomes, increasing non-wage benefits, and so on. But the problem is that actually it's reversed, and the proportion of the world's population, even those with high degrees, are not part of the precariat, and not part of the salariat. Underneath that is the old proletariat. And it was actually a lot of my earlier work, including the book on Jamaica, was looking at how people were pushed into the precariat, into the proletariat, and were having lives of manual labor, but with rising non-wage benefits, and were expected to be staying in stable jobs. That's disappearing as well, all over the world. It's not something unique to Jamaica or Britain or Japan, it's everywhere. And below that is the group that I've been writing about a lot in the past 20 years, which is precariat. And I want to warn you all that in 5 years' time, or whatever number you wish to choose, a lot of you will be in the precariat. So it's important for you to realize what it is, because it's the new mass class in the world. And in 2011, I wrote a book called The Precariat, the New Dangerous Class. And the thesis of the book was that unless we had a realization of what the precariat is about, and who is going to be in it, we are going to see a real social, political, and economic crisis. That book has been translated into 24 languages and has led me to be invited to give lectures on it, of over 500 lectures in over 40 countries around the world. It's a global phenomenon. And every single day, even now, I receive emails from some people around the world, from different parts of the world, saying, this book is about me. This book is about me because I am part of the Precariat. And I warned on page 1 of that book that unless people understood the Precariat and policies were developed to respond to their aspirations as well as their insecurities, we would see the emergence of a political monster. And in November 2016, you will not be surprised, perhaps, that I received emails from all over the world saying your monster has arrived. And of course, that monster is Donald Trump. He represents what this eighth giant that Olivine mentioned, the threat of neo-fascist populism. He plays on the fears that people have of the other, whether it's a racial fear, a migrant fear, a fear of women, a fear of people with disabilities, just plays on the fears. And he uses prejudice, and he's not alone. There are lots of people like Bolsonaro in Brazil and others who've used the same tactics of playing on people's fears, which are based on their insecurities. And it's very dangerous, obviously, and obscenely cruel and divisive. But I don't want to go on to that part. I want to define what is the Precariat, and then we can move on to other topics. The Precariat can be defined in 3 dimensions. First, it can be defined in relations of production, classic Marxist term, but you don't have to be thinking in a Marxist paradigm, if you like. It's basically a distinctive pattern of labor and work. And I make a distinction in my books between labor and work, which is extremely important for all feminists and all people who are concerned with the future of work. There is a distinction between labor and work. But the Precariat has to do a lot of work that is not labor. A lot of work for which people are not paid. It's not recognized in our national statistics, our economic statistics, or our social statistics, or our labor force statistics. But if you're in the Precariat, you have to do a lot of work that is not recognized. And of course, you're living bits and pieces lives. You don't have a sense of an occupational narrative. You are doing MAs, PhDs in a particular subject, but you have to realize the likelihood of having a career that is actually tailored to the learning that you are going to complete will be very slow, very low. The probability is you'll have to adapt and be flexible and have to do different forms of activity, combine activities. And the people emphasize that the Precariat has unstable labor. I don't like the term precarious work or precarious labor for a reason I'm about to come to. It's unstable labor, insecure labor, and that's not the same thing. And the second dimension is that the Precariat has distinctive relations of distribution. What that means is that they have to rely almost entirely on money wages. They don't get access to non-wage benefits, like pensions, like paid holidays, like paid medical leave, and that sort of thing, which is worth a hell of a lot, of course. And they don't get access to rights-based state benefits. And at the same time, they're exploited off the workplace, outside labor time, often by forms of rent by losing to short-term debt and so on like that. Exploited by debt. And that's part of the system, not an accident. And the third element, for me, is the most important, which is if you're in the precariat, you have distinctive relations to the state. What that means, and I think this is a very important area for postgraduate research and academic research by all of us, is that you're losing the rights of citizenship, even in your own country. More and more people feel they're losing social rights, they're losing economic rights, they're losing cultural rights, they're losing the rights to be a citizen, the right to have rights, as Hannah Arendt famously put it. And this leads to the critical point about being in the precariat. The original word stems from the Latin to mean to obtain by prayer. What this means is that you have to be asking for favors. You have to be asking your parents, asking your partners, asking your landlord, asking a bureaucrat, asking employer for favors in order to be able to survive. And the key word here is you are a supplicant. That for me is the most critical part of being in the precariat. Now, at the moment, the importance of understanding the precariat is that it's split. It's split into some people who I call atavists, people who are looking backwards. They feel they've lost the past. Those are the people that Trump and Bolsonaro and Boris Johnson and others play on to get their support. And these people tend to be less educated. And therefore, they listen to the sirens of populism. The second group, quite different, I call the nostalgics. The first people think they've lost the past. The second feel they don't have a present. They don't have a home anywhere, be it in Jamaica or London or anywhere. Wherever they are, they feel they don't have a home. These people won't vote for populists. They keep their heads down. They have to survive. The trouble with them, for them and for society, is that those people are not voting. They're not participating in the mainstream of society. They're not helping a progressive agenda. They're not standing up to the forces of inequality and so on. The third group is made up of people like yourselves. I call these the progressives because so many millions of people are going to university and college, and they come out after their parents and their teachers and their politicians at local and national level have promised that if they go to university, they will have a career, they will have a future. And they come out with debt and they feel they don't have a future. Now, this group will not vote for the populists. They're not fools. They've got sufficient education to understand those who play on fears for their own dirty politics. They won't go backwards either and vote for old social democrats. That's why I keep telling trade unions when I'm addressing trade union groups. I said one word often I can drive a precariat audience to rush for the bar to get a beer or something is to talk about trade unions, because the precariat is disgusted by the unions not standing up and understanding that they must forge a future that resonates with the progressive part of the precariat. It's important to understand at this point that precariat are not just victims. The great advantage in not feeling that you want to be in a full-time, stable, boring job for 30 years or 40 years. You don't have the false consciousness that your job, your current job, is the most important thing in your life. It isn't. The progressive part of the precariat doesn't suffer from a sense of false consciousness. It understands the alienation, it understands the sense of anomie, which everybody should study, and the sense of hopelessness in your job, but it also understands that we can stand outside and build our future and help build a better society. Now, if you think of the growing precariat, and this pandemic is creating a much larger precariat, much enlarged, much more insecure, then you come back to those 8 giants. Rentier capitalism and the new class structure has generated these 8 giants, and they are blocking a good society. Inequality, wealth inequality, much more than income inequality, chronic insecurity for millions and millions of people all around the world. It's a pandemic in itself. Growing private debt, so many millions of people, not only in the precariat, but increasingly in the precariat, know that they're on the edge of unsustainable debt. And this pandemic is tipping them into homelessness and potential suicide and so on. And that leads to the next giant, the sense of stress. The sense of stress is a pandemic, and we need policies to address the stress that causes rising morbidity, deaths of despair, and makes people less resilient to the pandemic and COVID-19 and other pandemics that will come. The next giant is precarity, this sense of loss of rights. Then you have automation, the robots. So many people are fearful that we're all going to be thrown out by AI and automation. I don't believe so, but it's increasing inequality. And then you get to the 7th giant. And I've argued in this new book, Battling 8 Giants, that this 7th giant is the one that will tip millions more across the world into supporting basic income. And of course, it's the threat of extinction. I hope every single one of you will participate in the Extinction Rebellion. We need to stand up and fight the disappearance of the species, global warming, pollution, and the deliberate avoidance of a strategy to roll that threat back. We need eco-taxes, but we can only have eco-taxes if the income is recycled to people who are paying from a position of insecurity, because otherwise it will merely increase inequality and lead to resistance. And also we need to understand that the best possible way of rolling back pollution is to shift the way we live from resource depleting labor to reproductive work, for care for the community, care for our loved ones, care for the way we live, care in the sense of creating a balance with nature. Young, educated people are the best placed in the world to understand all that. And they have to take the lead in combating that particular giant. And of course, the 8th giant is this neo-fascist populism, which is rushing towards us. Strangely, with my politics, I've been invited to talk about these issues 3 years in Davos, World Economic Forum of the elite. So it's been a very strange experience. But I think that many of the elite are understanding that we need a strategy to roll back rentier capitalism. Otherwise, these giants are going to overwhelm us. And that leads to the last point, which is what Olivine mentioned, and that's mentioned in the Massive Attack video, is the pandemic. I sometimes call it the trigger for the pandemic slump the world is experiencing. Just like the shooting of the Archduke in July 1914 was the trigger to the First World War, not the cause. This was a slump waiting to happen, a crisis waiting to happen. My new book actually came out in March, and I can say that I was arguing that before the pandemic struck. Doesn't give me any pleasure, but it seemed to me obvious that if you had just a slight downturn, then the combination would lead to a major crisis across the world. And I believe that a basic income is an essential ingredient of a new progressive policy that must emerge. Every country could afford to begin a basic income. We've done pilots in India, in Africa, in Canada, in Finland, and so on, which results I've summarized. And not only could we afford it, we need it for not only ethical reasons that I've discussed in my books, but also now today, it is an economic imperative. Because there's one lesson we're learning in this pandemic, which is the resilience of all of us, the resilience of society will depend on the resilience of the most insecure, most vulnerable groups in our society. If policies rescue the banks or rescue the wealthy or rescue the salariat, but leave the precariat and those out in the streets without basic security, we will not get out of the pandemic slump. And I'm having a webinar with the ANC South African government on Friday, where they're thinking of introducing a basic income. Malawi has gone forward, Togo has gone forward, South Korea is going forward. And nothing would give me more pleasure than to see a really creative discussion on how to do it in Jamaica. On that point, I will thank you for listening, and I'm quite happy to continue this discussion and listen to Olivine and others' questions.
Thank you. We have several persons here who are, well, experts in other areas. I'm in HR, but I'm looking straight at Sandra Latibaudiere, who is a social worker. She's one of the lecturers in social work. I don't know if Sandra has anything to say. She had done a little comment at the start when you were talking about unpaid income, and she talked about care, you know, just home care. Some of the most vulnerable members of the society are aged people and or children. They fall into that, but Sandra can speak for herself.
Thank you so much. Dr. Standing, a wonderful, 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 you know, groundwork that you have laid. I'm glad you're doing it in HR for the HR students, because I think we have been siloing our efforts. So social work, we do a lot of that. We talk a lot about globalization, the positive and negative sides to globalization. We look at the persons who are, you know, income insecure. We talk about how can we address some of those. In Jamaica, we have been under the structural adjustment program. So you know that some of our, you know, social programs and so on are influenced by that. Even now, we have executive agencies where persons are, you know, income insecure because they are working on contracts. So I'm glad you made the point about labor and work. And then you have the you know, the unpaid labor, the unpaid work of those caregivers who are looking after older adults and children who can't separate those work, and and that work is not included in the labor force, so that when those persons become who age out, they have no income because their labor / their work was not in the formal labor system, but they were doing work which was unpaid. And again, because we have an aging population. So I'm glad some of these things, I think our HR specialists need to start thinking about some of these things, because it has implications for staffing. It has implications for, you know, hiring practices. It has implications for, you know, how do we work with women as opposed to men, because we know that men and women experience things differently. So I'm glad we're starting the conversation with HR, and we need to expand it out more. And Olivine, thank you so much for inviting me. I would go on and on, because this area for me is very important, because we look at the vulnerable. So we work with vulnerable populations. We work with persons who have disabilities, who, disability across the spectrum, intellectual disabilities, those that can't work, families who are taking care of children with disabilities, who, have minimal support. And the COVID has just compounded a lot of what families are feeling. And a lot of my colleagues, Dr. Ricketts and talk about the inequalities that has emerged out of this COVID. COVID has put on the agenda, in the face of many people, a lot of things that we as social workers have been dealing with under the cover, but now it is now blaring on the agenda, and people cannot ignore it any further. I will stop right here and step back a little. But all of the issues of globalization, structural adjustment. People don't take into account the economic, that financial sector that influences everything that we do or don't do. Working on contract, COVID again, with the contractual arrangements, persons were put on were laid off. Our labor laws talk about that you can lay off somebody for 120 days, and some of those things, we really have to revisit some of those things that we're doing now that are really causing pushing persons further into poverty. But I'll stop here. Thank you.
Heather Ricketts was just sharing with us that the Jamaica Survey of Living Conditions will have information about unpaid work in the next issue. Heather, Dr. Ricketts is a social policy person, so it would be nice to hear from her.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. I must confess that I am in between meeting and seeing students, and so I have not been able to hear Professor Guy Standing for an extended period. But okay. I must say that I use his work in my teaching of social policy, and I have, done a bit of reading of his latest book, and the term, the precariat, certainly resonates with me, because in Jamaica and in these Caribbean territories, there are lots of individuals who are working, but yet fall in the category of the poor. So we have a pretty high working poor population in these territories. But I wanted to say, however, that the social protection systems in the Caribbean have to mature sufficiently to be able to offer things such as a universal pension, so that anybody, for example, irrespective of where one works, as in the sector, whether it be formal or informal, should be able and must be required to support a pension. So contribute to a national insurance scheme, so that they contribute to a social insurance program. And so I would say that social protection systems in the Caribbean can do far more and have to mature to be able to assist many who are in the informal economy and fall in the ranks of the working poor. I'll stop here for now.
Okay, and Professor Skoberg, Iris Skoberg, she wanted to say something. She is public policy and management.
Thank you. Good morning. But I think Disraeli's hand was up before me, so I'll allow him to go, and then I'll go after him.
Thank you very much. This is of interest to me. I am from I would say from the old school, from the 70s, where during those days we had an interest in transforming society, understanding the exploitation of the poor. But 40 years after, there's little to show that we have made any significant improvement in terms of the quality of life of the ordinary persons. It is of interest that you suggest a basic wage, which would be treated as a right. There was one of the contestant in the Democratic Party in the United States who promoted a similar idea. I think the response was limited, to say the least. But this is an idea that we need to promote. But the question is, do you see the class in control, the Trump class, them making any concession at all to what is being demanded now? And what it is that you feel can be done outside of a revolution, which I don't see as a real possibility now. A revolution would mean taking up arms. Of course, Trump has shown that he is willing to use the military to suppress any attempt by the ordinary persons in America to demonstrate their concern and challenge what is happening in that country. My own view is that that position will be demonstrated right across the world. So do you feel, Professor, that, I'll put it another way, what type of action we can take to resolve the situation without an open confrontation leading to war among the different groups in the different countries and different societies?
Lynn, shall I respond to some of these points before we get to a saturation where I forget the points made by someone earlier?
Sure.
Okay, let me start by responding to Disraeli, his points. I never use the term basic wage. It's not a wage, it's an economic right. That's the first point. I don't like the term universal because you'd have to have some restriction. On Andrew Yang, you're referring to as what the candidate who proposed it in the United States. I think it's very interesting that he did remarkably well, given that he had no political base to start with. He got through all the rounds without any funds, except his own money. And since the pandemic began, the opinion polls of support for basic income in the United States have just shot up incredibly fast. In Europe now, there was an opinion poll across the European Union, the countries of Europe, and on average, something like 71% of people are now in favor of a basic income. In many other countries, we've seen a surge of support. In Kenya, we have a fantastic network where 78,000 people have joined the basic income network. Fantastic, without any funds, but the people understand the need for basic security, and this pandemic has helped legitimize it. I then want to go back to your point about the Trump class. Nice term, but I think if you look at the fact that a presidential election in the United States is actually only about 50% or a bit more of the people who are part of the adult population go out to vote. And if you look at it, you see that Trump at his most popular moment had less than 30% of the American public supporting him. So we shouldn't exaggerate the appeal. He's a danger, of course he is. I hope all of us in this discussion hate what he stands for, hate his tone, hate what he's done. But I think that we are actually more powerful if we realize that. And what I think is going to be determining this new political agenda is that more and more people in the precariat are beginning to mobilize themselves and are beginning to organize. And then I want to use as something to come back to some earlier points that were made. particularly the points about care work that at the beginning. We need to mobilize voice in the Hirschman sense of it. Albert Hirschman used the term voice, collective voice, for people who are providing care, for people who are receiving care, and for people who are in the middle, because all of those groups are made vulnerable by their circumstances. Often care workers self-exploit and lead to illnesses themselves because they care so much. And they become over-committed, and understandably so, and a danger to themselves, unless they have voice to enable them not to self-exploit and to provide a balanced relationship between caregivers and care receivers. But in that context, let me say something that some of you who are students may not fully understand. What the hell is the difference between work and labor? Labor is what you do for money and you're paid for it. And if you do paid labor, it will be measured in the economic statistics of Jamaica or wherever. But if you do unpaid care work or unpaid voluntary work, it doesn't get counted as work at all, and it's not in our statistics. So we have the absurdity that a woman who is caring for her own children is regarded as economically inactive, not working. Whereas if she goes out and cares for somebody else's child and is paid for that, she's working. Well, of course, both things are work. And our statistics are a disgrace. And every feminist, and I hope we're all feminists, should be standing up and saying our statistics should be fundamentally overhauled. Now, in that context, let me talk about work in the precariat and give you an example. Because I think half of you will find what I'm about to say is a bad joke in a couple of years' time. If you're in the precariat, you can be expected to have multiple jobs in the course of just a few years. Most of those jobs will be short-term, and you'll have to apply for other jobs. It turns out that many in the precariat in numerous countries have to apply for thousands of jobs. Thousands, not hundreds or dozens. And in the process, they have to go through recruitment procedures, which are becoming more and more algorithm driven. And often, on average, a person who's educated, got a degree or whatever, may have to apply for a job and go through 6 rounds of filtering. First you apply, then you may be shortlisted. If you really knew, that would be 6,000 people. And then you have to do an aptitude test. Then you have, they say you've been shortlisted. Then you have to do another set of tests. And you realize that you're down to the last 1,000 candidates. Then you go through another. And it turns out that in the United States, for example, and in a number of European countries, the average number of rounds of the procedure is 6. Now imagine how much time you are going to be using in your life for applying for jobs. It's work. Don't tell me it's leisure. Don't tell me that it's enjoyable. It's stressful. But that is the reality. Now, you could deal with that. You could say, okay, if an employer declares a vacancy and you apply for it, the first time you apply, you pay for the costs, you pay for your time. But if then the employer says, I want you to do this test, this test, this test, the second round, you say, well, I would like a little modest payment to be paid for the applicants. The third round, the payment should be higher. They're asking people to spend their time. okay? I bet you, and then you can continue that process. I bet you, if you did such a simple policy, very quickly, the professional recruitment practices, the HR practices, would be improved enormously because they would want to spend less money. That's just one example. A lot of others applying for benefits, applying for this and everything. But I think you have to think from the perspective of the precariat. Going to Heather's point, I studied the Jamaican social security system for what it's worth over many years. And I remember going to unemployment exchanges in Kingston and Trenchtown and being, job stuck by the procedures. And I would argue that you now need to avoid going into the ILO model. There is no possibility of having an effective social insurance system in Jamaica or in Britain for that matter, because many, many people in the precariat and around it can't pay their contributions. They are not in secure, well-paying jobs from which you can pay a social insurance contribution. And so it becomes a fiction. You have to have more and more subsidy paid out of central government revenue. It's not a real social insurance. And you have a drift to social assistance in Jamaica as well as everywhere else, which creates incredible poverty traps. Many of you are going to be looking at organizations, HR practices, and the idea of a poverty trap is very important for you to keep in the back of your mind. A poverty trap arises, and if you say we're going to give benefits only for the poor, we're going to target on the poor, well, that means automatically that if you make an effort to move out of poverty and become non-poor, you're going to lose the benefits to which you're entitled. And it turns out in many countries that this means the marginal tax for someone in the precariat going from benefits into a low-wage job of the type they could get is 80% or more. In other words, they only get an extra 20% compared with the benefits that they may have taken ages to gain in the first place. And of course, that's a huge disincentive for people to take legal, low-wage jobs. And that means that they will either not take those jobs or they will go into the shadow economy to avoid tax, avoid everything, and therefore risk criminalizing themselves in a new way. We have to think from the perspective of the precariat in order to understand what is a feasible type of policy response for the 21st century, not go back to the post-1945 era of Beveridge and the social insurance scheme. And I think in a country like Jamaica, it's a fool's errand. It is inequitable, regressive, and chronically inefficient. And there's nothing to be gained by pursuing a traditional ILO type policy.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I am Iris Skoberg from the Department of Government. So, may I say that I'm a little bit confused by your arguments. I'm trying to understand your thesis. You have introduced this concept, precariat, and I am quite fascinated by it. But how is it different from the bottom billion that is used in other literature, the proletariat that is used in Marxist discourse, the marginalized that is used elsewhere? I mean, we have used so many concepts to describe the same set of people. I myself have attempted to understand the behavior between communities and policy officials, or the response of communities to policy edicts and have come up with this concept of the informal citizen that is published somewhere in the Global Encyclopedia of Public Administration, Public Policy and Governance. And that particular concept, I tried to understand how people feel about the space that they occupy and try to understand the complexities that are inherent in this kind of social membership. And the informal citizen is attached to the notion of the informal economy. So what I'm saying is that we have used many concepts to describe the same set of people, the same set of circumstances. That's my first point. My second point is, what is the solution that you're offering? Basic income. Isn't basic income the same thing as a minimum wage? I'm trying to understand. Many countries have minimum wage. Rich countries, poor countries. What is the difference? Income is earned assets. It can be passive, it can be active. Wage is what you're paid. So what is it? A basic income is a right, but how do you assume a right and you don't exercise responsibility? I am trying to understand the connection that you're making there. So we have minimum wage in the Western Hemisphere. What is it that is different with this idea of the basic income? Thirdly, you seem to be bordering on socialist ideas, I think. That is my interpretation, based on your response that the state should deal with these people, the precariat should respond to them. So it seems to me we're moving towards a socialist response, but socialist response in this period seems to engender different responses from groups. So is it a socialist response? Or are you suggesting that we go back to the welfare state phenomenon, that, you know, the literature about the welfare state and what has happened and why we are at where we are at? So basically, Prof, trying to put all your arguments together, trying to understand where exactly you're telling us to go to resolve this issue of the precariat. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eris. Thank you for those very strong points. Let me take each one in turn. I've written and researched extensively on the so-called informal sector, informal economy, informal citizen, and written extensively on that from around the world. So I know the literature, I know the concepts. I work with SEWA in India, the Self-Employed Women's Association, and there is some fundamental difference between the informal economy and the other concepts you mentioned, the marginalized and so on, from the precariat. The precariat is fundamentally linked to wage labor, whereas the informal economy tends to be small-scale production, informal activities, peasant sort of features, survival activities, and so on. The precariat is being precariatized in the sense that it is being subject to pressures to internalize and accept a life of unstable labor, wage labor, coupled with mechanisms of exploitation outside the workplace. And I don't think it helps conceptually to lump the precariat with the informal economy, the proletariat, and everything else, because they're fundamentally different. And if you do lump them all together in a descriptive term, bottom billion, whatever that means, I don't know what it means, you can't define it in a way that can induce you to think of policy responses. People who feel part of the precariat have a distinctive consciousness, which is fundamentally different from people in the informal economy. And I found that the reactions I get from around the world, people say, I feel I'm part of the precariat. So I urge you, please, to spend a little time looking at my books on that subject. But the second point is that a minimum wage is fundamentally different from a basic income. Minimum wage is you set a standard of minimum for any job. It's got to pay so many dollars and you've got to pay more than that. And that's the minimum wage. It's for wage labor. And in many countries, you have a different wage labor for young people and for others. Basic income has nothing to do with that. Basic income is you pay every person, every legal resident in the country, a minimum modest monthly amount in cash as an economic right. Now, that is fundamentally different. It's individual, it's unconditional, and it gives people basic security, and it's a matter of common justice. And it's also a way we can help dismantle rentier capitalism. A minimum wage won't dismantle anything. It will merely set a standard, which most employers will pretend to obey and find ways around. Basic income is not a panacea. It's not solving all things, but it's reflecting the commitment of all governments, giving everybody in their community, everybody in society, the means of subsistence. And that, I think, is very important. But the idea of a basic income is ethical, and it's now an economic imperative for the reasons I gave and I've given great length in the book, Basic Income and How We Can Make It Happen, which is summarizing all the research from around the world. And we do have an incredible body of research with what happens when people suddenly have a basic income. We did huge pilots in India where we provided a monthly basic income to about 6,000 individuals, and they all managed to improve their health, their schooling of the children, the economic activity. They did more work, not less, contrary to the prejudices of many people, because they had more energy, more confidence. They were able to feel in control of their time, and it improved the status of women because they had their individual basic income, and it improved the status of people with disabilities for the same reason. The same in Africa. We've done pilots in Namibia and so on, and in Kenya there's a big one. Same in North Carolina, where the results were incredibly impressive, in Canada, in California, and in Finland. So we have seen the results, and the results are very, very positive. They have an economic multiplier effect. And I urge you to consider that it's different from a minimum wage. I'm not necessarily against the minimum wage, but if you have a precariat, they don't really work. They've had a national minimum wage in Britain since 1997, and it's hardly worked at all. There are lots of failings. Now, the last point you made, I don't mind labels, but I've written a book called The Precariat Charter. And I asked the provocative question, what would be the policies and institutional changes that the precariat are advocating that are different from what the proletariat would have been advocating 100 years ago? And you see big differences. You see a huge emphasis on the need to revive the commons. You see a huge difference in type of voice organization that you want to encourage. You see a huge difference in the values of work relative to labor. And there are 29 policies in the book, and they are very different from what the proletariat were demanding 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. So I think that to call it socialist, I don't really mind, but it's not socialist in the sense of the welfare state capitalism of the post-war era. I'm not advocating that at all. I think that would be folly. I think that would be a terrible way of going backwards. I think we are now in a world where the precariat is the dominant mass class, and they're not being indoctrinated to accept as a norm stable full-time labor. That's not either what they're being expected to take or what many of the educated people who are entering the precariat want. And I think, therefore, we need to think differently. Let's not use old concepts. Let's have a new vocabulary. And that's why it's such a pleasure to be talking to students who are embarking on a journey where you're going to have to be developing new vocabulary, a new conceptual framework, a new paradigm. Because the old paradigms of social democracy and neoliberalism have broken down. This is a wonderful opportunity for you to be thinking irreverently, thinking creatively, and enjoying it because you're going to be playing with different concepts. Maybe some of those concepts that Iris has mentioned, maybe you will find that is part of your vocabulary. Great, that's fair, fine. But I think it's an ideal opportunity at this juncture where our old system has collapsed. And the worst thing, as I quoted a piece of graffiti on a Madrid wall, which says the worst thing would be to go back to the old normal. I think that's a very sound point. Olivine. I can't hear you, you're muted, Olivine.
Okay, I'm saying I'm completely bowled over. I was seeing some comments in the chat that, well, Heather has left, but she had a comment. What would you suggest, therefore, if social insurance schemes will not be helpful to the precariat? I would agree that social protection systems need to be more flexible to take account of the inconsistent earning flows of low-wage earners, and also need to leverage technology to facilitate easier methods of contributing. That's what she said there.
Sorry, I missed that. I was just reading the chat. Sorry, I missed your point.
Well, yes, it is Heather's comment in the chat. What would you suggest, therefore, if social insurance schemes will not be helpful to the precariat? I would agree that social protection systems need to be more flexible to take account of the inconsistent earning flows of low-wage earners, and also need to leverage technology to facilitate easier methods of contributing.
Yeah, I've addressed this issue in my book, Plunder of the Commons. And first of all, instead of a social insurance or a national insurance system of either the Beveridge type or the Bismarckian type, which were the two models developed and refined in the post-1945 era, instead of those, because they won't work with a huge precariat, we need at the bottom of society to give everybody basic security, which governments claim they want. We need to have a basic income. That's not going to be enough to give everybody an affluent, good life, but we must have that as a base. And then we have occupational schemes, private insurance, social insurance to a certain extent, state pension, top-ons, disability benefits based on people's extra costs and lower expected earnings and so on. You can build a structure. You need to give basic security. And I think it's very important for all of us to understand why basic security is so important. Basic security is a human need. We all need to feel basically secure. It's also a public good. The value of basic security for you and me is increased if we all have it, and it's very easy to show why that is the case. The value of everybody being secure is incredible. But also psychologists have taught us, and the evidence is overwhelming, that people who suffer from insecurity suffer a diminution of the mental bandwidth. Your IQ goes down. if you're chronically insecure. And anybody who has had a period in their lives of being chronically insecure will know what that means. You get stressed. Your capacity to think, your capacity to be rational, your capacity to take long-term decisions, all of those are diminished. Well, if you think about that, it's unfair of us to expect people who are suffering from chronic insecurity to be making rational, good decisions. And if you accept that, then you should be in favor, whether you call it socialist or communist or capitalist or anything, it's just labels. But it makes sense to want to make sure that all your fellow citizens, all your friends, your relations, everybody has basic security. That's what it's about. The enormous improvements in transformative capacities of communities, and we've got films showing this, when people had just a modest basic income and everybody had it. This is incredible. It's emancipatory. And I think that it's just not helpful to use pejorative labels associated with something else. Socialism, in its literal sense, means state control of the means of production. This is not anything to do with that. This is to do with making a good society, making it possible for all of us to feel we're members of a society that's treating people with dignity, respect, and giving to others what we would wish they would give to us. And I think that we're moving into a point now where millions and millions of people are getting it. And I'm delighted to say that my books are being bought and translated into many languages. And I get a lot of people writing to say they get it. Now that gives me pleasure, but it will only give all of us pleasure if we move strongly in that direction. And I think that's what is happening during this pandemic. Maybe one of the few good things coming out of it. Friends of mine in Britain who are campaigning now for a basic income say this could be the NHS of our generation. In 1947, millions of people in Britain said, a national health service? Impossible. Too expensive. Impossible. Wouldn't work. Terrible. Socialism, etc. Today, you try and kill an NHS and you'll get killed. Literally, if maybe not literally, but metaphorically. So I think that we're in a moment where we have to think differently. And that, I think, is why I wish I was studying for a PhD or a master's thesis right now, because this is your opportunity to be doing fantastically innovative studies and taking those into your career in a different sense from the old use of that word.
Right. Sorry, I see Professor Skoberg's hand up, but I have a comment here. Sandra Chadwick-Parks, she is a specialist in community economic development. She was saying that basic income can only become a reality if it's enshrined in constitutions. Otherwise, it will be subjected to the vagaries of political parties, as happened in the province of Ontario with a change in provincial government. That was her comment there.
Can I respond briefly, Olivine?
Certainly, yes.
Louise, very good point. What I've advocated in my books is that you would set up an independent commission outside Parliament, outside control of the political parties, that would determine the level, changes in the level, and how funding, etc., is managed, and set up a national capital fund along the line of Alaska or the Norwegian capital fund, with contributions like eco-taxes and land value taxes, and build up that fund to pay for a rising level of basic income. And I think it does help if it was put in the constitution, like in Mexico, it's now part of the Constitution of Mexico, that commitment to introduce a national basic income. I think that's a big advantage. So I agree with your sentiment, but you need to depoliticize the mechanism, just like they've depoliticized monetary policy by turning it over to central banks outside the control of finance ministers in many countries. So why not do it with your basic income as well?
Okay, thanks.
Right.
Professor
Yeah.
Silver?
Right. Thank you. Thank you for your responses to my points. And Sandra really touched on something, because one of the questions I had was the institutional framework that supports this policy direction, but you have answered that. But in tongue-in-cheek, I have to say to you, how do you win elections if everyone is satisfied? If everyone is given a basic income and is now satisfied in a developing country, post-colonial state, with all sorts of structural issues, I am looking ahead and see whichever government puts this into, implements this policy, they will never be voted out. So how do you have a democratic process that is vibrant with that sort of thing? Just a tongue-in-cheek situation.
Well, I'll give you a tongue-in-cheek response. I believe that what will happen is that once a party introduces it, very quickly other parties will say, yes, we want that. Now we've got it, let's focus on other things. And I think you would have a very quick return to democratic politics, and actually improve democratic politics, because it will take out this populist appeal playing on people's fears. But I don't think that people will be content with a modest basic income. It's going to be a third of subsistence or half of subsistence. People want to improve their lives. Once you've got a basic income, then you want to move forward for your children, for your loved ones, and your community. And I think that then people will be working for other benefits. So I'm not worried about that. Let's worry about the immediate future, and the longer term future will look after itself. But right now we have a pandemic crisis of enormous proportions. Unless we have something like a basic income, we will not get out of it. That is my firm belief, and it's got nothing to do with any slogan or anything like that. We need to remember that the security of all of us depends on the security of the weakest groups.
Okay, thank you. I would also like, yes, to hear from the students. Do any of the students have anything to say? Marsha was on early on the scene. Anything, Marsha? Any of the students brave enough to step forward? Alicia, I see Alicia here.
Olivine, while Alicia is coming on, may I ask Prof to refer me to one of your books that I will purchase immediately, one that just gives me a broad view, because I really like the arguments and I'd like to introduce it to my course. So you can send it in the chat, or tell Olivine and I will get the information.
No, say it out openly. Say it out openly, please.
Well, I think, Iris, that I would recommend first that for students, I think the Precariat, because it's the New Dangerous Pride. That's the first book that I wrote on this particular subject of the Precariat, because that's something that is appropriate for the youth, if you like.
Thank you.
I think for all of us, my basic income and how we can make it happen, which is published by Penguin. It's very cheap. It's not cheap in quality, but it's cheap in price. and it's also published by Yale University Press. But being the Yale University Press, they wanted to give it another title, which is called Basic Income, A Guide for the Open-Minded. That was my suggestion. And so it's published in the US and it's published in Britain. It's been translated into many languages as well. So I think for you, given the questions you were asking, I would say that.
Thank you.
I hope one of the students will come on, but I still wanted to read another comment from Dr. Chadwick Parks. She said, in April 2017, the then Liberal government of Ontario piloted the Ontario Basic Income Program. It targeted 4,000 persons for 3 years at a cost of $150 million across the province. A change in government in 2018 led to the pilot being scrapped, despite results that people receiving the basic income continued to work and were able to move into better jobs. The new progressive conservative government argued that the basic income program was failing to help people become independent contributors to the economy. Furthermore, the eco-taxes instituted by the previous government to deter economically destructive behaviors were also dismantled by the provincial government, the progressive conservative government.
I respond to that?
Because I've seen your videos on India and they go against what this is saying here. But our government is saying.
I'd like to respond to that. There are very good points there. I was involved in early stages of the Ontario pilot. And it's interesting that the right-wing party, during the election, they said, we will keep the basic income pilot going. And they did that because it was proving very popular. The first week they got into office, the new minister scrapped it. That was classic dishonesty. But it indicated that the pilot was gaining a lot of public support. It was proving to be very successful. And some of the data, even though the government tried to suppress the evaluation data, the data have been collected, filtered out, and have shown that there was a huge improvement in people's health, stress, and so on. And I think that this was a very successful opening gambit, because now we have a huge Canadian network promoting basic income. There's huge support. Trudeau, the Prime Minister, has said he thinks it will come. The Foreign Minister has told me herself that she thinks it will come. And I think that it's going to be linked to carbon tax. In British Columbia, we're seeing the idea of carbon tax plus carbon dividends, which are a form of basic income. So I am actually not disheartened by what happened in Canada. Notice that they only got rid of it through dishonesty. And you know, that you can't deal with corrupt politicians other than to get better politicians. And many young people who are going in the precariat are going to be making good politicians in the next few years, I bet.
All right, some of the students are chickening out, you know. They're just saying that the discussion is interesting and all of that. But, well, then maybe we could ask one of them, because we wanted them.
Oh, that's unfair.
Well, no, the thing is, we wanted to broaden the thinking of the HR, the future HR practitioners, the future OB researchers. So I don't know if any of them wanted to even tell us how they thought that they might want to apply this. I mean, it is a learning thing. It is our orientation discussion. So to hear from a student or two, I would really be happy. I'll even buy you a textbook, who knows?
Alicia.
I think this is a very interesting topic for HR professionals, because as an HR professional, you have to be aware of the social issues that exist. And these social issues will influence the decisions you make as an HR practitioner as well as an individual, because it not only affects the work setting, it affects people's families, their overall lives. So I think we all can resonate with the precariat and the populism and all of which were discussed, because these are things that influence how people behave at work and how they view their work. One of the things that resonated with me was when he said that, you know, people are working and, you know, they don't, I'm paraphrasing, they're not seeing a future, they don't know how, you know, working is fulfilling their needs. So I think this is very relevant to HR. So it's a very good presentation and discussions on my part.
Thank you,
Excellent, Tom.
Alicia.
Excellent.
Yes.
You're welcome.
Excellent.
Anybody else? Camille? Well, unfortunately, we lost. Okay.
If
Yes?
not, I can wind up. If
Well, I
not,
was just thinking, unfortunately, we lost a couple of our HR lecturers. They had to leave. They just made some comments and said
they're
goodbye.
joining
But
the Precariat. They're joining the Precariat. So
yeah,
that's all.
it's going on. So,
Well, Olivine, at this point, we've been talking for an hour and 20 minutes. I'm sure everybody would like to go and have a drink or something. And I would just like to thank all of you, especially the students, for listening. I hope you found it of interest. And I want to wish you every possible success in your studies and in your futures. I wish I were there at the moment. As I said at the beginning, I love Jamaica. You're very fortunate to be there, even though it has many social problems, even though you've suffered from the IMF strategy of austerity for too long. And austerity has not left this country stronger in social sense. But I think it's such a beautiful place, and Jamaicans are beautiful people, and I really feel privileged that I've spent years, not only in Jamaica, but Guyana and Trinidad, and I regard the Caribbean as a beautiful part of the world, not just for the scenery and the beaches and everything like that, but for the culture, the sense of culture that you represent, which is very distinctive. So thank you very much for listening.
thank you too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was very insightful.
Good.
Thank you, Professor Sandy.
Say goodbye.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye. We will talk again.
Yeah, we'll talk again, Olivine. Right.
So
Good.
thank you to
Bye.
everybody. Thank you to everybody
Thank
for
you.
coming. And we will broadcast this for the students who weren't able to make it, because this is early in the day in Jamaica. It's late for Prof, which is why we had to have it now. But so we will do this again for the students. All right. So thank you so much to Prof Standing for coming forward. Hopefully we'll see you in person next time. Maybe next year.
So I hope so
Okay
too.
then. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.